Hey y'all, welcome to Killer Queens, a true crime podcast. I'm your host Torella, and like most millennials, I've always had an obsession with true crime. On KQ, you'll find light true crime stories, millennial hypes and gripes, some adult language, and maybe a special guest here and there. Just like a 90s sleepover, we're just a couple BFFs hanging out, so gather round and let's launch right into it. In the early morning hours of Sunday, May 29th, 2005, shots rang out from the Shaker farm in Bellefontaine, Ohio. Nikki Vigatis received a call from her 15-year-old stepsister begging for help. When Nikki arrived at the farmhouse, she immediately called 911. Detectives arrived to find 6 people on the property, all dead from gunshot wounds. Stacy Moody, the youngest child that lived in the house, was barely alive. Just a few hours later, the Logan County Sheriff had closed the case, ruling it a murder-suicide. Just hours. Despite his certainty, many people continued to question whether this massacre was a planned cover-up, possibly by law enforcement. Y'all? We don't do that. All right, we've got some trigger warnings here. Sexual assault of a minor, and death of minors as well. This case was requested by Elizabeth McGowan. So, hey girl, thanks. Thank you so much. And thanks to Madison for writing it up. I don't know why. Like, I knew that's what I was doing next. And then my brain said, what did we come in this room for? Basically, I guess. I don't know. All right. Let's talk about who the Moody family is and was. In the small town of Bellefontaine, Ohio, just 48 miles northwest of Columbus, lived the Schaefer family. The family for several generations had lived on their 450-acre dairy farm called Shaker Farm. The Schaefer family was well known in the town with a population just under 14,000. I mean, no bigger than your mama's Jack Russell. You know it, okay? Those who grew up in Bellefontaine said that despite it being a small town with just a few restaurants, gas stations, and a grocery store, the people who lived there took care of one another. It was still it was a really close-knit community. It kind of just in my mind, I'm thinking of Schitt's Creek. You know, like the one cafe, Twyla's there, obviously. Just like the singular locations, like if you're going to the vet, there's, well, Ted did have some competition with the one guy who did the ads with the puppies. And so they got the bunny cam and everybody got a show. Anyway, very just super small. That's kind of what I imagine here. There were several houses and small properties on the Shaker Farm property. Again, it's ginormous. I mean, Shaker Farm sounds like it's almost the whole town itself, right? 450 acres. In one house lived 37-year-old mother, Sherry K. Schaefer, and her 2 children, 18-year-old Scott Moody and 15-year-old Stacy Moody. In another house, which is about 300 feet away, were Sherry's parents. They lived there. That's 66-year-old Cheryl Schaefer and 67-year-old Gary Schaefer. Now, we are going to talk about, and you can always see sources for our episodes on our website. We have like a post for each episode, and you can see there like what sources our writers used. For this episode, a big source was a book by Rob St. Clair called Saving Stacy, The Untold Story of the Moody Massacre. And Rob St. Clair did a ton of research. He was very detailed in this book. So we are using it. Thank you, Rob, for doing so much work on this case so that we can condense this story down. And we highly suggest you go get the book. It was fantastic. Cheryl was born and raised on Shaker Farm, and at the age of 20, she married Gary Shaker, and the two moved into a rental property on the farm. Cheryl was a teacher at the local elementary school. Gary worked as an architect at a construction company. In addition to their day jobs, Cheryl and Gary took over some of the responsibilities on the farm. They would raise and take care of the family's dairy cows, stuff like that. Eventually, Gary became the farm manager, despite Cheryl's mother, Wilma, still being the uncontested ruler of the farm. Let's talk about Wilma. Wilma insisted that her daughter and son-in-law only have one child. She believed one child was sufficient enough to carry on the legacy and the farm, and having any more children would just complicate things. Wilma, that's not your baby. That's not your marriage. That's not your decision. But Wilma said so that's what they did. Also, I thought people who had farms, I thought you had more kids because, many hands make light work, But I don't know. That was her decision. So, and Cheryl had also been an only child, I guess, because Wilma said so. So she and Gary stopped after their first child, and this was their daughter named Sherry Kay Schaefer. Sherry Kay grew up on the farm, knowing that one day it was going to be her responsibility to care for. At 17, Sherry met 20-year-old Steve Moody at a county fair. Her grandmother, Wilma, said, "This is never going to work out. This is never going to work out. You should not marry him. I don't think this is going to go well." And they were like, "But we're in love. Okay, we're totally in love." So they got married. Steve moved on to Shaker Farm with Sherry Kay, and then Sherry Kay had their 2 children, Scott and Stacy. Wilma's prediction of the relationship not going well, though, actually came true fairly fast, unfortunately. After 5 years of marriage, Sherry Kay was looking for a divorce attorney. Unfortunately for Scott and Stacy, the separation and divorce got really, really messy. Sherry Kay filed complaints of child abuse with Children's Services against Steve, and those allegations were investigated and were unfounded. She then filed multiple allegations of sexual abuse against Steve that reportedly took place while the children had been visiting him. Like the initial complaints, the investigating organization did not find any evidence to support those claims, and they were also labeled as unfounded. Finally, on August 31st, 1992, Sherry Kay and Steve's divorce was finalized. The children remained living on the farm with their mother, and Scott reportedly chose to distance himself from his father, and it remained that way until he died. Steve ended up remarrying, this time to a woman named Audrey. They ended up going on to have 5 children of their own, and Stacy grew very close to one of them. Scott and Stacy spent much of their childhood on the farm raising animals. They participated in the 4-H club and FFA. Of course they did. They both won trophies and ribbons at local fairs for showing the animals that they'd raised on the farm. Sherry Kay struggled as a single mother, having been fully financially reliant on her parents and Steve in the past. So she would apply for jobs, but then she'd quit after a few weeks, like nothing was sticking, and she was really struggling with that. She ended up getting into 2 separate car accidents, and after those car accidents, Sherry Kay was prescribed painkillers by a doctor and unfortunately developed an addiction. Her grandmother, Wilma, noticed the change in Sherry Kay's behavior and saw the future of her farm going right down the drain. And I mean, I don't know Wilma, and y'all don't know Wilma, but every single one of us knows that Wilma's not going to stand for that. So, she took action, okay? Wilma ultimately organized a bit of a complicated will with her attorney. The probate judge actually referred to it as the most unusual will to have ever been filed in their county. So when Wilma, Cheryl, and Gary all died, the land would get split at that point into 2 pieces. Okay, so when Wilma died, Cheryl and Gary would have life trusts over Shaker Farm, which meant that they would not be allowed to sell their piece. However, they would be able to live on and benefit from the farm for the rest of their lives. When Cheryl and Gary died, Sherry Kay would have a life trust over one of the 2 pieces of land. And then when Sherry Kay died, Scott and Stacy would each have a life trust over 1/4 of the farm. The second half of the farm that was left after Cheryl and Gary died would be sold, and the proceeds would be directed to establish an educational trust that would ensure her name was never forgotten. Very interesting. On July 15th, 1995, Wilma passed away, still with the hopes and intent that her great-grandchildren would eventually carry on the legacy that she'd built for the farm. It's also interesting, though, that she wants them to carry on the whole legacy with each 1/4 of the farm and then half of it sold off for an educational fund. I guess she's still considering that the legacy of the farm because, I guess they probably don't need all 450 acres to maintain their business side of it, but when you need as much as you can get, that way if you grow and like if you're able to expand, you can expand in that other half. I don't know. That's what Wilma said and what Wilma said went, y'all. I'm not going to argue with her, okay? Unfortunately, Cheryl did not manage the property evaluation and taxes well after Wilma's death, causing the farm to lose thousands and thousands of dollars in fees and fines. Eventually, after several court hearings and disagreements, a document was finalized with how the estate's assets would be determined and distributed. There was no way to predict what would take place on Shaker Farm over the next 24 hours. Soon, the disputes over estate and unpaid back taxes were not going to matter. When Stacy woke up on the morning of Sunday, May 29th, 2005, she immediately felt intense pain, and she couldn't understand what was going on. She didn't understand why she was in pain. So her first thought, her first gut reaction was, go find my mom and tell her something hurts. I don't know what's wrong, Mom. Something hurts. So she goes to find her mother and she shakes her, and Sherry Kay is laying in her bed, but Sherry Kay is not waking up. So then she slowly makes her way down the stairs and into the kitchen, and she's at this point very dizzy. She's in a lot of pain, but she goes down the stairs. She ends up losing consciousness for a while. At some point, she comes to. She finds her cell phone and she starts calling numbers until she finally reached her stepsister. And I also read that because of her injuries, her vocal cords were affected. And so she was kind of making strange noises when people would pick up the phone. And so a lot of these people were just hanging up because they didn't know what was going on. So she ends up getting a hold of Nikki, and she tells Nikki, her stepsister, Nikki, I think it's Vagades, I'm not sure how to say it, that her mom had been beaten up and she couldn't wake her up. Nikki and her husband and their 4 kids quickly drove over to the farmhouse. They have no idea what's going on. Now, Stacy thinks she's been beaten up too. These are the words that she's using. I've been beaten up and my mom has been beaten up and I can't wake her up. So they get there and they immediately see blood stains across the linoleum when they walk in. And they said the house smelled really bad. Stacy suddenly fell out of the bathroom door with blood all over her. At 10:35 a.m., Nikki called 911 and reached the Logan County Sheriff's Office. She told them that her stepsister had been beaten badly and needed help. Still on the phone, Nikki went upstairs when she heard her husband yelling. So they found Sherry Kay in her bed without a pulse. They give this information to the dispatcher. Nikki and her husband continued down the hallway and into Scott's bedroom. Scott was laying halfway down his bed. His feet were hanging off the edge and they were on the floor. A young girl was laying next to him, slumped against the wall. Both were dead with a rifle lying between them. Nikki told the dispatcher that she'd found Sherry Kay's son and his girlfriend and that they had both been beaten up as well. The dispatcher instructed Nikki and her husband to go outside and find the address to the farmhouse. As they ran downstairs, Nikki starts screaming. There's another body lying motionless on the couch. Logan County deputies responded quickly to the scene, under the belief, though, that they're responding to an assault. They don't know that this is a murder. Based on Nikki's report, they didn't know if anybody was dead or if they just weren't responsive. And at this point, they think that they've been beaten. When they arrived at Shaker Farm, authorities found a massacre. 37-year-old Sherry Kay was dead in her bed, the blankets tucked around her with a gunshot wound to the left temple. In Scott's bedroom, they found him also dead with 2 gunshot wounds. Remember that. Beside him was his 14-year-old girlfriend, Paige Harshbarger. She was also tucked in and shot once in the left temple. In the living room on the couch with the blankets pulled up underneath her chin, deputies found one of the Moody's kids' friends, 19-year-old Megan Karras, dead from a gunshot wound just behind her ear. 15-year-old Stacy had been shot twice, once in the cheek and once in the neck, but she was still alive. Deputies tried to ask her what had happened, but she was unable to process what they were saying. She was immediately flown from Bellefontaine to Ohio State University's medical center in critical condition. Her injuries were grave, including that the artery bringing the blood to her brain had been severed. Her prognosis was poor at best. Like at the very best. They really did not expect her to survive. Shortly after the bodies had been discovered, Scott and Stacy's father, Steve, arrived on scene. He was absolutely shocked at what the police told him. He asked the detective where Cheryl and Gary were. That's Sherry Kay's parents. Remember, they live 300 feet away on the farm. And the detective said, oh, well, I was under the impression they were out of town. And Steve was like, no, they're not out of town. And if they haven't walked up here to see what's going on, then there's something wrong. So detectives go to their property on the farm. They knock several times with no response. The door was locked, so they had to force their way into the home. And inside, they found 66-year-old Cheryl laying face down on the floor in the kitchen, dead from a gunshot wound behind her ear. Her husband, 67-year-old Gary, was draped over his wife, also dead from a gunshot wound behind his ear. There were 6 people dead and 1 barely clinging to life at this point. In such a small town like Bellefontaine, word of a massacre obviously spread like wildfire, and it made sense that the authorities would want to get to the bottom of what happened quickly. It was shocking to everyone, however, when Logan County Sheriff Michael Henry was heard announcing over the police scanner that the case was already closed by noon on the day the murders happened. Remember, Nikki didn't even call 911 until 10:35 a.m. Seriously? You don't have autopsies at this point. You don't have toxicology reports back at this point, obviously. You don't even have time to have all the photos taken, I wouldn't think. Like the crime scene techs haven't even finished collecting evidence. And at noon, you say, we've wrapped it up. We have the best detectives in the world. Because how else do you do that? I don't understand. At 7 p.m., less than 10 hours after Nikki found Stacy bloody and near death, Sheriff Henry held a press conference. In Rob St. Clair's book about the family and the murders, St. Clair described the scene from that evening. Quote, at 7 Sunday evening, Logan County Sheriff Michael Henry straightened his wrinkled t-shirt, adjusted a Dale Earnhardt Jr. ball cap, and stepped before a crowded group of reporters representing state, local, and national media outlets. Sheriff Henry told reporters, quote, it's tough on us. We knew these people. We're familiar with these kids. I feel so badly for these families and this community. Sheriff Henry then went on to explain that he and his team had determined what had happened on Shaker Farm earlier that day. He said that sometime between 7 and 10 a.m. that morning, 18-year-old Scott got out of bed and walked a quarter mile to his grandparents' house with a loaded .22 caliber semi-automatic rifle, and then he shot them in their kitchen. They were in the middle of fixing breakfast. There was orange juice poured and sat on the table. Eggs were out. The frying pan was on the stove. Like they're ready to cook, right? So they're getting ready for breakfast. He walks in with a gun, shoots both of them directly behind their ears. I really feel like the location being directly behind the ear for many of these shots is really interesting. Everybody else at the other house where Sherry Kay and all the others were found were supposedly asleep and shot while they laid there. Then I guess you could get right up behind somebody's ear fairly easily because they're not moving really. They're not doing a whole lot. But Cheryl and Gary were just big fat awake and aware. How you did that? How you did that in that one spot? It's not like you shot him from across the room. Like, I don't know about that. Anyway, I feel like that's interesting. Scott was then assumed to have walked back to his own house and shot Megan Karis, I'm not sure how you say her last name, I'm so sorry, while she slept on the couch. Then he walks upstairs. He shoots his mother, then he shoots his girlfriend, Paige, then he shoots his sister, Stacy, before ultimately shooting himself. The sheriff added that there were no signs of struggle at either household, and it appeared as though all of the victims had been shot while they slept. Oh, the other thing they don't have is ballistics. Do you have any shell casings? Do all of the bullets match? I mean, I'm assuming these bullets are still lodged inside the victims. Do they match? Are these different guns? Like, how do you, I don't know. The motive was explained simply that Scott had felt increasingly overwhelmed by the responsibilities and problems of the farm that he was set to inherit following his graduation. That was it. If you thought there was more to that, there's not. We guess he got up. We guess he walked over. We guess he shot his grandparents. We guess he came back. We guess he shot everybody. Nobody heard gunshots. Nobody got up and moved. Nobody ran away. Everybody just laid there. And I reckon he was probably stressed out. That's probably why he did it. Case closed. Thanks for asking. Seriously? The Logan County Sheriff's Office closed the case before they even interviewed the one living eyewitness. Let's talk about the investigation. Air quotes, the investigation. Okay. The investigation prior to closing the case had seemingly been minimal, remember? It happened that morning. By noon, they were like, we solved it. Aren't we so cool? Once Sheriff Henry arrived on scene, detectives were given assignments, including coordinating with the Ohio Bureau of Criminal Identification and Investigation, logging and tracking evidence, and conducting interviews. Nikki, Stacy's stepsister, retold her story to the detectives, and she explained that the phone call that she'd received and what she'd found when she got to Shaker Farm. She explained all of those things again. She also said that Stacy told her when she woke up, there was an older guy with gray hair standing there with a gun, and I tried to push the gun out of the way. Nikki also elaborated on the family dynamic and told detectives they should speak with Sherry Kay's boyfriend, Dave. Dave met detectives at their office and shared his alibi. He'd been at home with his live-in girlfriend of 18 years. He did admit that he and Sherry Kay had had a relationship, and that he last saw her a few days ago at the farm, nothing out of the ordinary. Dave also said that he didn't know of any problems between Scott, his mother, or his grandparents. While the area and the roads surrounding Shaker Farm were still blocked off, detectives were notified that there was a man that wanted to speak with them. This man was 25-year-old Jason Southerly. So Jason said that he had lived with Sherry Kay on and off for a few years, but now they were just friends. How many is a few years? That's a big age difference, but anyway. He had initially been involved with another renter on Shaker Farm, and then became friends with Sherry Kay and her family. St. Clair, in his book, highlighted some of the odd things that Jason said, particularly about Stacy. Quote, when asked, Southerly explained to the detectives that he slept with Sherry Kay in her bed last night. Then, without prompting, that reminded him of something else. He said, the reason I originally started wandering over to Sherry Kay's house was because of Stacy. I wanted to date Stacy. I don't know if you remember, because I just said it, but he's 25-year-old at this point. Stacy's 15. So because 15-year-old Stacy refused his advances, he decided to date her mom instead. What is happening? What is happening? And that's just okay with everybody? I don't know if Sherry Kay knew that. Ew. Jason was able to shine light on what happened at the farm on the night before the murder. So he said around 5:30 p.m., he and Sherry Kay went to Red Lobster for dinner. There is nothing fancier. And then to the Walmarts. While in the store, Scott and Stacy called their mother and said they were going to have some friends over that were coming from a bigger graduation party that had been going on earlier. Jason told detectives that Sherry Kay was known to buy beer for the kids, but the rule was they could not drive if they had been drinking. So yeah, you can come over here and I'll buy you alcohol, but they all have to stay here. Anybody who drinks has to stay here. Nobody can drive. You can agree with that or disagree with that. That was her rule. So Jason and Sherry Kay stayed up until about 3 or 3:30, and then he left. He said he walked past Morgan, who was asleep on the couch, and Scott's friend Brett Davidson was laying on the other couch. Jason said that nothing abnormal had happened at the party. Everyone seemed like they were having fun. When he left, everyone was asleep. Nothing out of the ordinary at all. After detectives finished interviewing Jason, they were notified that Sherry Kay's second ex-husband, Steve Wolf, was there and wanted to talk with them. So Wolf said that he last spoke to Sherry Kay about 4 months before that, reporting that she still owed him money and property from their divorce. It had been about 2 years since they divorced at that point, and detectives asked him about his former stepson, Scott Moody. And Wolf said, quote, He's not the person I thought would flip their lid. I thought it would be Gary. I do know that Scott was doing something drug-wise. I know when I lived there, Scott would be fine one day and not the next. He would be belligerent, mouthy, and aggressive. Grandpa Gary acted the same way, but worse. I was always watching my back when I lived there. Ultimately, Wolf told the detectives he didn't believe Scott was capable of committing the horrific crimes that had happened that morning. After speaking to several different people who'd been at Shaker Farm on the night before the murders, detectives were able to piece together the events. And I feel like I have to just reiterate that at this point, when they're talking to the different people that were there, they had already closed the case. They had already determined that Scott had killed everybody and then killed himself. And I guess drug himself down the bed because there were like smear marks behind him and his feet were hanging off the bed. But that they had already determined this. They didn't talk to anybody till after they decided that. I guess that's one way to do it. I don't know. So 19-year-old Andrew Denny was invited over to the farmhouse around midnight on Saturday. And he said that everyone there seemed drunk except for Sherry Kay and Jason, her boyfriend. There were no guns visible and everyone seemed to be having fun. After drinking a few beers, Andrew and Stacy went up to her bedroom. They made out, then they fell asleep. They set the alarm for 6 a.m. because Andrew had to work with his father that morning. So he woke up around 7 a.m. that morning, which was late because Stacy kept hitting the snooze button. When he left, the other bedroom doors were closed. He saw Megan asleep on the couch and a man he didn't know sleeping on the other couch. The man who'd been sleeping on the other couch was one of Scott's friends, remember, 18-year-old Brett Davidson. Brett said that he was there on Saturday night and fell asleep around 4 in the morning. He said he woke up suddenly at 6 a.m., which was odd since he hadn't had that much sleep. He went upstairs to tell Sherry Kay that he was leaving. She walked him to the door and told him to come back for breakfast after he was done with his chores. And Brett recalled that she locked the door after he stepped out. Nothing seemed strange. But that doesn't line up with Andrew's timeline because he says he doesn't even wake up till 7 and Brett's asleep on the couch. He says he woke up at 6, told Sherry he was leaving, and he's out the door. So, I don't know. Brett did tell detectives that Scott would never hurt his family. He hadn't shown any signs of being troubled over his prospects of graduation. Brett said that Scott had not had any alcohol that night either. According to everyone who'd been at the party, Scott was in a good mood. There were no arguments. Nothing seemed to predict all the horror that would take place in just a few hours. It just seemed like it happened. People continue to come forward to speak with detectives, some hoping to clear Scott's name, others with stories of a young man with a bad temper. 18-year-old Amanda Arthur told police that she had dated Scott for almost their entire senior year, and she'd broken up with him just 2 weeks before that. When asked why they broke up, Amanda told them that he'd been acting really weird, saying, quote, "I found someone I felt happier with, someone that didn't make me feel as scared." She told a story about how Scott had lost his temper at the table one night for absolutely no reason. And she said that this was not out of the ordinary either. She said that Scott was under a lot of stress, so he would just fly off the handle for no reason. He had a lot of stress on him with the farm. His grandparents were always on him. They didn't want him to have a life outside of the farm. Some of the time he talked about killing himself. Now, this is not Amanda's fault. But just to any, not even just young people, to anybody listening, if you have a friend who you know is acting strangely, she said that, he was acting weird, he had all this stress on him, he was flying off the handle for no reason, that became just his norm, he was so stressed out, he was also talking about killing himself. Please tell someone. Please tell someone. Because you just don't know what's going to happen. And while most people think something like this could never happen. Like it's so rare and it's so out of the ordinary. If it was a murder-suicide, I mean, you can't take that risk. So please tell someone. You want to prevent anything that you can prevent. You want to prevent anything that you can prevent. If there is a way to get someone help, and they're confiding in you that they're having those feelings, please, even if you think it's nothing and they're just blowing off steam, it could be something more. So please, please, please tell somebody. Amanda said that Scott had actually threatened suicide multiple times to her, and he'd become more and more withdrawn and emotional lately, and she said she could barely recognize him anymore. I mean, obviously, now that we know what happened, that's a big deal, but it's a big deal anyway. So again, just if you have a situation like that, please tell someone. Stacy Moody miraculously was still alive. After 3 days in the hospital, her doctor allowed investigators to speak with her. However, no one from the sheriff's office came. The Logan County coroner, needing to finalize his paperwork, did visit Stacy in the hospital. Following procedure to complete his findings for the case, the coroner asked Stacy, "Who shot you?" Stacy still did not know that her family was dead. She did not know that her older brother had been identified as the murderer. Stacy remembered waking up, seemingly without reason, on Sunday morning. She saw a man standing over her in her bed, holding a gun with a huge barrel. He shot her in the neck and walked out of the room. Stacy then heard 2 more gunshots from inside the house. The man then walked back into her room and shot her again. Then he walked back out of her bedroom. Stacy again heard 2 more gunshots. The coroner asked Stacy one more time who shot her, and she went on to describe an older man with short gray hair wearing a blue shirt with a larger build. She said that she'd never seen him before. Her brother, the supposed killer, was 5'8" and 135 pounds with short brown hair. When detectives came to the hospital to interview Stacy, they were unaware of what she had told the coroner. So she explained to them what she'd done on the night of the graduation party, then how she'd woken up to the gray-haired man holding a gun above her. After she stopped hearing gunshots, Stacy went from room to room. She recalled seeing Scott in his bed with a shotgun in his hand pointing toward his face. The detectives returned to Stacy's hospital room the following day and asked her again who shot her. She again told him that she didn't know. After more questioning and clear attempts by the detectives to imply that Scott was the shooter, Stacy blatantly told him that the man that she saw was not her brother. "I know what my brother looks like. That is not who stood over me and shot me." Okay? Now we have the autopsies, because again, all of these decisions were made without seeing the autopsies and without anything, without toxicology, without speaking to witnesses, they hadn't even talked to Stacy yet. I feel exasperated by this. Scott's autopsy results immediately raised questions, the most pressing one being, if he had shot himself, why had he done it twice? Now, is that possible? Sure. Is it likely? Heck no. He had 1 wound below the left ear and 1 through the right side of the roof of his mouth. Detectives explained that the first shot, the one below the ear, was just simply not fatal. The chief medical examiner added that sometimes people flinch as they pull the trigger. The shot didn't immediately kill them, so they reposition and shoot again. Both of the grandparents had gunshot wounds in the neck behind the ears. Sherry Kay and Paige both had been shot once at close range in their left temples. Megan had a similar wound on the right side of her neck just below her ear. To many, the shot seemed like they'd been made by someone who was very familiar with guns and somebody who had good aim. Scott, according to friends, was very far from a gun expert. He supposedly didn't have any guns. He didn't like guns. Wasn't his thing. 12 days after the shootings, Stacy was finally released from the hospital. Once her doctors had determined that she could handle the news, her father explained that her mother and brother were both dead and that Scott had been named the shooter. 5 days later, detectives visited Stacy at her father's house, hoping to get more information about who it was that she saw that night. Stacy told them, "The more I think about it, I don't remember seeing a gray-haired man. I remember seeing a dark figure with a blue shirt on, with the gun shooting at me, and I remember trying to get away. I don't remember seeing a face." She then again recalled that she had heard gunshots, but heard nothing after she was shot for the second time. And this feels very like she told multiple people about this gray-haired man with the blue shirt on, and they kept pushing her. And I also listened to a True Crime Garage episode on this, and they said that the detectives were like, "We know you're lying. You've got to tell us the truth." Like, they were bound and determined that they were going to have her say that it was Scott. Like, there was something something about that. And they just knew it. And so they were going to have her, like, she wasn't remembering correctly or something. The detectives and Stacy went back and forth. She would continue to deny that she saw her brother during the shootings, only afterwards when she saw him lying lifeless on his bed. Stacy also mentioned that she thought it was really odd the way that she had found her mother in bed. She said, quote, "She was tucked in real well. It wasn't right. Normally, she's all over the place." The two detectives returned to their office, but before they could even finish their report, they were summoned back to the Moody household. Stacy wanted to talk to them again. Her story was completely different from what she told them just a few hours before that. At this point, she said that she had a flashback of Paige and Scott arguing and hearing Paige yell something like, "Put it down." Stacy said that her brother probably went into their grandparents' house while they were out doing chores, then hid until they came back in. She said he probably came back to the house, shot her first, since she didn't recall hearing any gunshots beforehand. She directly told the detectives, "I saw Scott shoot me." Detectives finally felt like Stacy was telling them the truth. Unfortunately, it did not last long. A week later, she told them that she never actually saw Scott, but detectives continued to question her. To me, it seemed like they were just never satisfied with what she said, because she said multiple times before this that it was the gray-haired man with the blue shirt. He had a thicker build, all the stuff. Why now is it? I mean, obviously they already thought it was Scott and they wanted to close it. But this is the thing, like, yes, there are some like perpetrators or witnesses or whatever who will lie and lie and lie and lie, and then finally they're ready to tell the truth, right? That does happen. But it just seems like in situations that we have covered that it's like detectives just aren't happy with what you're saying until you give them the story they want. And then they're like, "Okay, now you finally tell me the truth." You don't know just by talking to somebody, unless you have video evidence of it happening and they're telling you it's happening a different way or something. Like, yes, there are pieces of evidence that will tell you, but she was also shot in the head. So her memory is going to be faulty no matter what. And it's such a traumatic experience that she might not know. It's possible that her brain was protecting her from this being her brother. And so her brain is now remembering somebody completely different. That could happen. But either way, it's like you don't have to, I don't know, you don't have to hang your hat on what she's saying she saw necessarily, because there's a lot of things that would affect her memory at this point. But pushing her to say one thing or the other just to me feels icky, Like, if you have the evidence that says it was Scott, then you have the evidence. Eyewitnesses can be wrong all the time. Like, I don't understand this pushing and whatever. But anyway, she said, "When I woke up, I saw Scott standing over me with a gun. Initially, I didn't realize who it was or what was going on. I thought it was some kind of a joke. I realized it was Scott, and then he shot me." One of the detectives asked her if this story was really the truth, or did she just want to put an end to everything? Which is another red flag for me. If you're just trying to get it over with because they're not accepting what you're saying. Like, if you have to ask that question, then you're fucking not doing a good investigation, I feel like. Or you're not dealing with the witness properly. But she said, "This is the truth. I know Scott shot everyone. I saw him shoot me. I just don't want to believe that in my head." Okay. Logan County Police Chief Ron Murray was one of the most well-respected members of law enforcement in the area. He was familiar with the Moody family. His son was friends with Stacy. And one day, Murray asked Steve, Stacy's father, to come by his office. He had some concerns he wanted to share about the crime scene. Murray proceeded to point out several things about the crime scene photos. Scott had been found laying on his bed, halfway down the bed with his feet on the floor. And there were blood smears above his head, which Murray thought indicated that Scott's body had been pulled down from the original position where he'd been laying. There was more blood at the top of the bed, which Murray surmised was from the first gunshot. Rob St. Clair, the author of Saving Stacy, which like we said, has extensive research on the case, wrote this on his public Facebook page regarding the discrepancies of Scott's body and the rifle. Quote, take the official photograph taken by the Logan County Sheriff's Office of Scott in his bedroom with his feet on the floor. The photograph clearly shows the rifle firmly tucked next to Scott's body with his thumb in the trigger guard. The obvious impression, Scott shot himself. After Deputy Wyrick arrived at Sherry Kay's house and cleared the scene, the next two people to enter the house were EMTs. Jim Collins' written statement that he provided to the Logan County Sheriff's Office simply said the rifle was within arm's reach of Scott. When questioned later, Collins was more specific. The rifle was not touching Scott, and he didn't have his thumb or any part of his hand on the rifle's trigger guard. Next into the house came Detectives Stout and Brugler, and we're going to talk about Stout. Later, the photographer took pictures of the crime scene. Was someone not happy with where the rifle was placed? Did someone then move the rifle next to Scott's body and put his thumb in the trigger guard to ensure that there could be no mistake that it was a suicide? St. Clair also mentions that none of the shell casings in either house had fingerprints on them, which would lead one to assume that whoever loaded the gun was wearing gloves while doing so. There were plenty of unanswered questions and unexplained findings that should have, at the very least, led detectives to investigate more in depth before just closing the case. In March of 2007, Stacy underwent hypnosis in order to hopefully finalize what she'd seen on the morning of the murders. As Stacy was deeply hypnotized, she said that she could see a man with short gray hair wearing a blue shirt. It wasn't anyone that she knew or could remember having seen before. It was imperative to get to the bottom of what had happened, as everyone was waiting for the distribution of Sherry Kay's estate as well as the Shaker Farm property. After months and months of delays, the probate court finally ruled that one half of Sherry Kay's estate would go to Scott's estate. This essentially meant that the money could be used to further research and test and investigate whether or not Scott was actually the killer, which sucks that you would have to use your own money for that at that point, because that's what the investigators are supposed to do. But they're not doing that. So, perfect. The other half of Sherry Kay's estate would go to Stacy. In the last chapter of his book, Rob St. Clair tells a story of a phone call that came into the Logan County Sheriff's Office the day before the murders. A deputy sheriff answered the phone. The male on the other end of the line was asking directly for Sheriff Henry, who was not there. The deputy took a message and hung up the phone. He told two other deputies that had just walked in that a farmer had just called, mad, and wanted to speak to the sheriff. He said that the farmer found out that some of the deputies had been having sex with his granddaughter and her friends at the local high school and then threatening them if they didn't agree to do so. He told them that the last name of the caller was Schaefer. So presumably that's going to be Gary Schaefer, who was killed. And he'd called the day before. And there's a record of this. And why they didn't send anybody out? I'm sorry, what? We need to get to the bottom of this. But he just took a message. And now all of them are dead. Except for Stacy, who miraculously survived. What? In October of 2005, Stacy's father and stepmother went to Logan County Children's Services to file a report. And they filed a report saying that they believed John Stout, one of the two lead detectives on the murders, was having an inappropriate relationship with Stacy. In January of 2006, Stout was indicted on several counts, including felony sexual battery and endangering a child. The sexual battery charges were eventually dismissed because Stacy did not want to testify. So again, we put the onus on the victim to prosecute the perpetrator. Stout did plead guilty to the charge of attempted child endangering, which was a misdemeanor. Stout said that a few months after the shooting, he'd had Stacy in his vehicle and thought about speeding, which could have endangered her. That's what he's talking about. Why did he have her in his vehicle again? What? And I also read that there was a situation. So the reason that Stacy's dad and stepmom went to the police was because they had picked up the phone and Stacy was on the phone. Like they had picked up the phone to use it, I guess, but Stacy was already on, right? So they hear this conversation. It's her and Detective Stout. And he's telling her to lie to her parents. He's telling her, lie to your parents. Tell them that you're going to stay with a friend this weekend. You and I can go away together this weekend. Like it was very obvious that they were having a relationship. She's a teenager. He's a law enforcement officer who's the lead detective on her murder case. And supposedly he was spending like a lot of time with her and all this stuff. But because Stacy didn't want to testify, it got dropped. What the fuck? Stout was placed on supervised probation. In July of 2008, he requested to have his record expunged since Stacy wouldn't testify at his trial. The judge agreed despite Stout having already pleaded guilty to the charge. It was later learned that Stout had made a settlement with Sheriff Henry in the Logan County Sheriff's Department. He was paid $135,000 in several payments from Henry's discretionary account in return for resigning. He was not able to seek employment with the department again, but he could with other agencies in Ohio. The murders that happened on Shaker Farm that night, according to law enforcement, have been investigated fully. The case is closed, and Scott Moody remains the only documented person behind the shootings. And I did also either hear or read, this may have been in the True Crime Garage episode, that there were other people who had called in seeing a man with gray hair wearing a blue shirt kind of wandering around, coming up to their houses, trying to get in and stuff around the same time. We don't know who he is. And was it Scott? Maybe. What I don't understand is how you shoot that many people. I mean, sure, they were asleep. You got to think somebody's going to wake up. It feels like you'd have to have more than one person to keep somebody from getting up and fighting back or something like that. I don't know. It's just, the whole thing is bizarre. I would love to know your theories. What do you think happened? Because this one is, a real head scratcher. But I love you guys. Catch you next week. Bye. If you like this episode, be sure to like this episode and follow the show so that you never miss out on new episodes. Get in on the conversation on Facebook and Instagram. You can find us at Killer Queens Pod, or you can join our Facebook discussion group at Killer Queens Podcast, where we discuss cases covered on the show and all things 90s. If you want to submit a case to be covered on the show, visit killerqueenspodcast.com/case submission and just complete the form. And if we cover the case, we'll give you a shout out on the show. Lilas.